All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, this is Agem DK. I'm with the U.S. Human Rights Network, and we're very excited to be able to put on this follow-up webinar on CERD, and specifically on how groups can effectively engage the CERD process. Just a little bit of background. The U.S. Human Rights Network is a national network of groups, of organizations, and individuals working to strengthen and grow a human rights movement and culture in the United States. And we are particularly invested in building a movement that is led by people who are most directly impacted by human rights violations. And as we say on the screen, we're really talking about building and growing and strengthening a people-centered human rights movement in the United States. One of the things that the network does is try to engage as many groups as possible, particularly grassroots groups and groups that are directly impacted by human rights violations, in the use of international human rights mechanisms, in this case, particularly the United Nations, to hold the U.S. government accountable to its human rights obligations. And so we're really excited to be able to offer this webinar today, and we're very excited about our speakers that we have on board. I have put on the screen an overview of our agenda, and we'll hand over very shortly to our next speaker. But just to go over what we'll be talking about today, we're going over our goals. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening on July 2nd, which is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. And we're delighted to have the co-chair of the U.S. Human Rights Network CERD Task Force, Marcia Johnson-Blanco, who will walk us through those things. And Marcia Johnson-Blanco is with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Then we'll be talking about how groups have used CERD as a human rights mechanism to advance human rights and racial justice in their work. And first, we'll be hearing from Andrea Carmen, who is Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council. She is also a member of the U.S. Human Rights Network's Board of Directors. And second, we'll be having Joteka Edie, who is with the NAACP, and we'll be talking also, and has done a lot of work using the UN previously, as has Andrea. And we'll be talking to us about the longstanding work that the NAACP has done in engaging human rights mechanisms, and in particular CERD. And CERD stands for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. In other words, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So it's commonly referred to ICERD or CERD. And then we'll be followed with our very own Salima Hankins, who's the CERD coordinator, and we'll be talking about, practically speaking, what's next, and providing some information, concrete information for what groups need to be doing from this point on moving forward. And so with that, I will hand over to the illustrious Marcia Johnson-Blanco.
Thank you for that great introduction, Agem. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. What I'm going to be doing now is just talking a bit about the goals of this webinar, as well as why we're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and to alert you to the upcoming Day of Action, which ties in to the Civil Rights Act. Essentially, we are having this webinar at the time when we are highlighting a very important anniversary this week, and that is the Freedom Summer, and we're going to be talking a bit about how CERD fits into or CERD advocacy fits into this anniversary that we're celebrating. The Freedom Summer highlighted the courage of many in the face of violence resistance to the push for against discrimination and for equal rights. And as you know, some paid the ultimate price with their lives, particularly Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, whose disappearance and death really captured the nation's attention and focused the nation on the work that many were doing to ensure equal rights in the South. And can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, thanks. And so we are going to, in this presentation, talk about how the human rights and civil rights fit together and how you can make the most of the CERD review. But before talking about that, I wanted to talk a bit about the Civil Rights Act and how it fits in with our CERD advocacy. And as you can see there on your screen, in June 1963, following in a speech immediately after the bodies of Goodman, Chaney, and Schwerner were discovered, President John Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this Civil Rights Act would succeed efforts in 1957 and 1960, where there were also Civil Rights Acts that were passed, but yet weren't completely getting the job done in terms of pushing back and fighting against discrimination. And President Kennedy noted in that speech, excuse me, the heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we're going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. And as you know, in November of 1964, President Kennedy was assassinated, and President Johnson used his first speech 5 days after the assassination, calling for the passage of the Civil Rights Act as a commemoration of the legacy of President Kennedy, and he called for the enactment of a Civil Rights Act without compromises, saying, "I urge you again, as I did in 1957 and again in 1960, to enact a civil rights law so that we can move forward to eliminate from this nation every trace of discrimination and oppression that is based upon race or color. There could be no greater source of strength to this nation, both at home and abroad." And basically what we are doing with our CERD advocacy is lifting up that desire as well, not just what is in our domestic laws, but also in our treaty obligations that complement what we're trying to do domestically. And as you're going to be hearing a little later in the webinar, we're going to be talking about how we tie that in a very concrete way. So I just wanted to talk a bit and highlight some of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act, particularly the Title I, which barred unequal application of voter registration requirements. Significantly, Title I did not abolish literacy tests, and that would come later with the Voting Rights Act. Title II outlawed discrimination in hotels and motels and public accommodation that was part of interstate commerce. There was a private club exception at the time. It also Title III permitted the Justice Department to bring litigation against to secure desegregation in public facilities. Title IV desegregated public education. Title V brought about the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and which was to give reports and really lift up what was happening with regards to discrimination and providing a record, particularly for Congress to use about how to combat it. Title VI is the non-discrimination in federally assisted programs provision, which basically disallows discrimination by any program that got federal funds, that gets federal funds. Title VII is the outlaws discrimination in employment of any business exceeding 25 people, and also created the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, to review complaints. And then Title VIII requires the Census Bureau to collect registration and voting statistics based on race, color, and national origin. And as you all know, these titles of the Civil Rights Act, which said was signed into law on July 2nd, and which has basically worked to transform America, we are currently in the middle of celebrating the anniversary. We're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, and this leads directly into the National Day of Action that we are planning as part of our CERD advocacy, and tying in the fight against discrimination as embodied in the CERD Treaty to our national fight against discrimination. So the goal of the Day of Action will be to commemorate the Civil Rights Act, but also to raise awareness about ongoing discrimination and also the role that CERD can play in addressing that ongoing discrimination, and more specifically to promote a national plan of action that has been required by the CERD Treaty. In each review, the CERD Committee has been calling for the U.S. to adopt a national plan of action to combat racism. The U.S. Human Rights Network and the CERD Committee have put forth a template and a model about how we think this can be done, and so we're going to be lifting up the plan of action on July 2nd. And please keep posted to the website and the emails that you get from the network to learn more about how we're going to be doing that. We're going to be organizing a Twitter rally, and we'll have more information coming on that. So at this point, I will stop with that overview and introduction and get to how this works with our advocacy portion of the webinar, and turn it over to Andrea Carmen, who's with the International Indian Treaty Council. Andrea?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and respectful greetings to everyone that's listening and also the other presenters. I'm going to be asking someone to change the slides out there in webinar land, so the next slide is fine here. I just will say that the International Indian Treaty Council is 40 years old this year, in June of 1974. It was founded specifically by Indigenous peoples and nations in South Dakota, but there were Indigenous peoples from all over the continent participating, over 5,000, specifically to seek a voice in the international arena based on our nation-to-nation treaties, not just with the U.S. and Canada, but other nation states as well, and to seek redress of our human rights. So this process of the CERD is a very important process for us because it is legally binding on states such as the United States, and we enter into it based on our treaty relationship, our nation-to-nation relationship with countries like the United States. And you can see from this picture, this is a review, one of the most recent ones we've been involved with at the CERD of Canada in 2012. And you can see, the tribal nation leaders as well as organizations, Indigenous peoples organizations, they're in the room. We won't be in that room this time because there's too many of us coming from the U.S. for the review, but this is the regular CERD room at the Holly Wilson Next. This is a definition that is really important, I think, for all of us as activists from our various communities and constituencies, is to really look when we're preparing for this process of how the ICERD, the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, defines racial discrimination in very broad terms. Of course, it addresses exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. So it is not just focused on what we usually consider racial discrimination, but can be applied very broadly, which Indigenous peoples do, of course. Next slide. It's important when we work with these international processes as Indigenous peoples or any grassroots peoples that we really look and see what the CERD has said about our struggles. So Indigenous peoples focus a lot on General Recommendation 23, and the general recommendations are produced by the committee, the treaty monitoring body, which as we know is called the CERD in this case, to instruct states and give them guidance of how to apply the provisions of the convention, addressing specific issues or, in this case, specific peoples. And it's really important, the strength of the land rights and the strength of the recognition for free, prior, informed consent that the CERD has said in general, which we're going to be using, of course, for the review of the U.S. It says where Indigenous peoples have been deprived of their lands and territories traditionally owned or otherwise inhabited or used without their free and informed consent, that states are called upon to take steps to return those lands and territories. And we consider that, of course, very strong language and very appreciated language. Next. It's important to recognize that Indigenous peoples entered into this work on the UN treaties with treaties of our own that are international agreements with states such as the United States. Over 500 treaties exist, over 300 that were ratified by the Senate, just like CERD was, which are legally binding to this day, and that consent is a treaty principle. This is just a quote. I won't read the whole thing from the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota Nation and the United States. That says that consent must be obtained by the Indian peoples before non-Indians can enter into their land. Of course, these treaties have also been violated, but the CERD is very good at also recognizing the international quality of these treaties that Indigenous nations have. Next. We look at also, and I think it's important for everyone to do that, to really look at the concluding observations that the CERD made against, or I won't say against, but recommended improvements to the United States last time. And one area that we're really focusing on in our work for the upcoming review is that the United States was recommended to consult with Indigenous representatives that were chosen in accordance with our own procedures to ensure that activities carried out in areas of spiritual and cultural significance did not have a negative impact on the enjoyment of their rights under the Convention. And you'll see the focus on sacred sites and the protection of sacred areas, waterways, practices, ways of life, resources that will be highlighted by Indigenous peoples at the upcoming review because, of course, the United States has not complied with this recommendation. Next. This is really important for my nation. We're divided by the international border between U.S. and Mexico and really impacted relating to our health by the export of banned pesticides. And it was very much of a breakthrough that the United States was called on to ensure that transnational corporations that they license on their territories don't negatively impact indigenous peoples outside the United States. And the U.S. has specifically stated in its report this time that it doesn't agree with this recommendation, which, brings a problem for all of us, because the U.S. has actually stated they don't consider the recommendations from the CERD to be legally binding. And so they challenged them, and we can expect, I think, this time to see some pushback from the CERD on those assumptions. Next. It also elevated the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from aspirational into the realm of legally binding in relation to the U.S. obligations under the convention. It told the United States that it needs to use the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples that we fought for over 30 years at the UN, and also fought for equal participation in its development, that they need to use it as a guide to interpret their own legal obligations under the convention. And the U.S., in fact, in its report also challenged that recommendation, that it didn't agree with it. So we'll see what happens there at the review, because we plan to also point out ways in which this has not occurred. Next. It's important that the UN Declaration, continues to be our focus when we're addressing the CERD, and you'll see that, from a lot of the work that Indigenous peoples is doing, because the grassroots Indigenous peoples worked on this declaration and ensured that it is, in fact, the minimum standard, as it says in its own text, to ensure the survival and dignity and well-being. And you can see this is from the preamble of the declaration. It condemns racism as racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. And this is very similar in language, in fact, to the preamble of the CERD, the fifth preambular paragraph. I just wanted to highlight that, the connection between the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the actual text of the CERD Convention. Next. It prohibits non-discrimination and equal rights, and again, says Indigenous peoples should be free from discrimination of any kind. And you can see this is a photo, actually, of an example of the kind of discrimination that we suffer. A Christian cemetery, with a fence and, all respected, and on the bottom is Indigenous cemetery being dug up for making a road, and this is repeated all over the country, and we plan to really hit hard on this issue as well. Okay, next. Combating violence against Indigenous women and children. This is another area that we're going to focus on, and Article 22 of the UN Declaration calls for the elimination of all forms of violence and discrimination against Indigenous women and children. And we will be focusing on that as well. Next. You know that Indigenous women suffer one of the highest rates of sexual violence of any women in the United States, and a very high proportion perpetuated by non-Indigenous men. So this continues to be a focus for us. This, of course, is the cultural rights and sacred sites. That's Mount Shasta, threatened by geothermal development in California. So next, I'm just trying to highlight here some of the rights issues that have been affirmed in our struggle on the UN Declaration to get it adopted, which it was in 2007 at the UN, and the U.S. Finally was the last country. It voted against the declaration at the General Assembly, but it changed its position in 2010, and I also want to thank the U.S. Human Rights Network for their strong advocacy with the United States to make that switch. They were the last country in the world to change the no vote. This is just another issue that we want to highlight. This is a threatened coal mine in Chickaloon Village, and that's one of the issues that we're highlighting as well. And it says that the United States and other states must obtain the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples before development occurs. in their lands and territories. And, of course, this is violated all the time by the United States. Next. Another one is the use of free prior informed consent relating to hazardous materials, Article 29. That's a picture. The top picture is military toxics dumped in St. Lawrence Island. And we are working with the tribes of Savunga and Gamble, who are on this island, to bring this issue to light, as well as the pesticides being dumped in Rio Yaqui, Sonora, Mexico, from the United States. Next. I won't go into this because this is probably a whole other teaching opportunity, but there is another opportunity for making submissions in between the reviews of the United States that we use a lot, which is the early warning and urgent action procedures, Indigenous peoples threatened by mining. But this is the voting rights. There's a lot of issues that could be highlighted in this procedure as well that other peoples have as well. Okay, next. And just really quickly, I'll show just a couple of urgent actions that we've done that are going to be then highlighted as part of the review this time. And that's Western Shoshone Elder Carrie Dan, and the Western Shoshone are also preparing their own shadow report, as well as combining with our Sacred Sites one that's a big consolidated report. Next. The Navajo Nation, we're working on that, the San Francisco Peaks, and we are doing a shadow report on that issue because the CERD has told the United States to consider cease and desist and get the free prior informed consent, and they have not done so. So we're highlighting that as well. I think my time's about up, but I'll finish really quickly. Next, these are just some of the shadow reports that Indigenous peoples are in the process of preparing. I mentioned some of them already. We're also doing one on decolonization and restoration of government in Alaska, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii, the Mining Act, and I think most of them I've already highlighted. And my final slide is how to be effective, and this is really an important organizing tool and a way that we can work with our communities to help them understand that their struggles are human rights struggles that are protected under international legally binding conventions, as well as the treaties that we have, which are also binding. It's important also to look at lack of compliance with what the United States has already been told by the CERD, and also afterwards to really look at implementation and how to publicize. And our main message is if we don't tell them, how will they know? The United States is not going to admit to the most grievous forms of racial discrimination against Indigenous peoples or anybody else. So we need to be there with our own voice to make sure that at least impunity isn't continuing. Thank you very much. I think that's my last slide. And this is just my last slide is that we're very proud to say that one of our own members is the president of the CERD as of February 3rd of this year, the first Indigenous person that was ever made to be the only one that's a member of a treaty body, but is now president, and that's Chief Wilton Littlechild, who's chair of the Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, speaking on February 3rd of this year of what the significance this is for us in terms of recognition of our participation in the UN system. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that wonderful presentation on how IITC, the International Indian Treaty Council, and Indigenous peoples have used CERD to advance justice in Indigenous communities. Next on, we have Joteka Edie from the NAACP. Joteka, are you on the line?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful. So take it away, Joteka.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I just want to thank the U.S. Human Rights Network and your leadership and the entire staff for all the work that you do to pull us all together. It is a very imperative and very important work. I will need some assistance with the PowerPoint slide. My name is Joteka Edie, and I am with the NAACP. I serve as Senior Advisor to the President and CEO and Senior Director of Voting Rights for the NAACP. And I really wanted to just take an opportunity to talk a bit about how the NAACP uses the CERD process. I want to start off by just having just an overview of the NAACP's international impact and the history, because for us, the NAACP as an institution, CERD and the work of CERD and all of the work of the UN and the human rights treaties within the UN, we feel are very much a part of the NAACP's worldview and very much part of the NAACP's mission, and that has been really since the founding of the NAACP. As early as 1911, W.E. Du Bois, a great leader of the NAACP, and three other additional delegates actually attended the first Universal Racist Congress in London. In 1947, I think many of you, and I think it's particularly germane to the issue of CERD today, many know that the NAACP, Mr. Walter White and W. Du Bois submitted what was entitled An Appeal to the World, which outlined the plight of African Americans in the United States. And there was major impact felt in the United Nations and in the United States, because really basically it was a shadow report of sorts. It wasn't called a shadow report then. Really was outlined a lot of the issues that face African Americans today. And I think there's a lot that if you have an opportunity to look at that document, it is eye-opening, and it is absolutely inspiring to see the way that they were thinking in 1947. But in many ways, it's very sad because a number of the issues still remain the same. Because in that appeal to the world, they lifted up issues of the plight of voting rights, of housing, discrimination as it relates to the criminal justice system in the United States, and economic disparities in the United States. And so that was one of the times in which the NAACP really made major impact in the United Nations. In 1968, we continued our work. Roy Wilkins, who was then the executive secretary, what we would call president CEO today, was designated as the chairman of the U.S. delegation to the International Conference on Human Rights. And then even in the late 70s, Dr. Benjamin Lawson Hooks presented an NAACP task force report on Africa to the Special Committee Against Apartheid at the United Nations. So the NAACP has had a long history, and our work as it relates to the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is no different. And so we're on the slide. I apologize. We're now on the slide entitled CERD, the significance of the CERD. So the significance for the NAACP, and I think the greater human rights community, is that it's one of three human rights treaties signed and ratified by the United States government. Of course, there are optional protocols that the U.S. has signed on to. Very important for us is that state parties have an obligation to uphold the treaty agreements, and that federal or state jurisdictions are obliged to the tenets of these treaties, and that there's a review process that happens approximately every 5 years that gives us an opportunity to advocate. Next slide. For the NAACP, and this says ICCPR, and it should say CERD, so we apologize for that. The NAACP has issues, a strategic approach, which we call the NAACP Game Changers, which covers a number of key issues ranging from health access and equity, economic justice, criminal justice reform, voting rights, and our climate work and our educational equity. And so the NAACP's game-changing issues, the way we do this approach, we look at how do we utilize this international mechanism to advance our domestic priorities. So we don't view this as an international priority. We view the work with CERD as utilizing an international mechanism and a human rights mechanism to allow us to further advance our domestic priorities. So key issues that we raise include voter suppression and felony disenfranchisement. We will have a heavy focus on that around CERD. Racial profiling, the use of force by law, the death penalty, mass incarceration, and access to quality education. And also, not on this slide, is also around health equity, which is also very important, and particularly around HIV and AIDS and childhood obesity and equity rates. We find that, as it was noted by Andrea, that all of these issues are raised within the CERD and within the CERD treaty. And so it's important for us to look at how we advance our issues that we fight for every single day. Next slide. As it relates to our goals, and I think these goals, and we are sharing this as just really a template because we think that other organizations, of course, could look at this model as you're looking at your own goals. But for us, we are looking at going into CERD or any treaty process, review process with really three goals. And the first is to shape the parameters in which the United States is reviewed. How do we ensure that we are ensuring that the committee members are notified and they have information as it relates to our viewpoint and our policy agenda so that we can shape the process? Number two, impact and influence the CERD recommendations made to the United States. A lot of that happens in Geneva. A lot of that happens outside of Geneva. So how are we making sure that we're impacting and influencing the recommendations that will ultimately go to the U.S.? And then the third goal, which I believe strongly is the most important goal, is to work with the United States government to implement recommendations made by the CERD committee. We believe wholeheartedly that takes us back, if we could just think of this circle, the circle of shaping this process, influencing this process, but implementing the recommendations. It takes us back to where I started, is our policy agenda and how it is rooted in the work that we do every single day. Next slide. So when we look at the NAACP's approach, we kind of break it up into three buckets of timeline or categories. Prior to a UN review, our approach is the following. We ensure and we work to submit shadow reports, and we're currently working on a shadow report with partners and also a shadow report for the NAACP to ensure that we're on record leading into the proceeding. Second is engaging with partners. I think this is extremely important. I've had the opportunity to do advocacy work in the UN now since, I think it's been since 2001. I started when I was very, very young, and it's been a lot of time in various international forums. And one very important aspect of the work is actually being in coalition. Because in the UN, and I think in general, we're stronger together than we are in silos. And so it's very important for us to engage with partners going into a review so that we are aligned and that we're also maximizing resources. Next is outreach to committee members when and where possible in advance, and then outreach to UN staff and leaders. And how do we really maximize UN staff, particularly in the High Commissioner's office, to begin to have meetings and conversations about work that they're doing that aligns with the treaty and also our policy agenda. I can't stress enough following the issues. That's one thing that we spend a lot of time doing, making sure that we follow the issues and the thread of the issues throughout all the UN processes. And then having a communications plan prior to going to Geneva. Of course, there's always the coalition's communications plan that we work with, but how do we have each of our organizations have a communications plan, whether we know what we're tweeting and know the coalition Twitter handle and we're tweeting out, but that we're making sure that we have a plan for social media digital photos, and really having a communications plan and articulating that we are taking these issues to an international body that is rooted in a treaty signed and ratified by the United States. And then finally, making sure that we're part of a meeting with U.S. representatives before going there, so they're clear that we are going there, and they're clear that we have an agenda, and this is what our agenda is, so there are no surprises. The second part of our approach is while we're in Geneva. And so some of the things that I want to highlight is, making sure that we provide data and research. And that's something that is really important to the committee members. They have such a limited time. They get a lot of paper. So how are we very strategic and specific in giving them exactly what they need, giving them the questions, and really taking all the flutter and the clutter away and just getting straight to the point. Also hosting side panels and forums with partners while in Geneva to really elevate the issues, and then direct advocacy and oral interventions. Of course, there's such limited time, and so it's very important that we're all mindful and good coalition partners, but making sure that we are speaking directly to committee members when and where possible, and that we're providing oral interventions on the issues that we care about. And then connecting with NGOs and other representatives while there, and meeting with the U.S. representatives while we're there as well. And then finally, while in Geneva, but certainly not least, and I think is most important, is lifting up the voices of those that are impacted. I think that, and that's something that the NAACP makes it a priority and very important for us to ensure that we are lifting up the voices of those that are impacted, because they not only we believe that they should be empowered to tell their own stories, but I think also experience shows that their testimony is extremely powerful to committee members and to moving the work forward. And so that's a really important part. Finally, a part of our approach and how we look at and how we do the nuts and bolts of advocacy is post-Geneva. And that's what's most important. We can't just all go to Geneva and do good work and get concluding observations and then go home and do nothing. We would have wasted a lot of time and resources. So we have to actually do the follow-up work, and that's working on implementation, meeting with the U.S. government and the various agencies. So it's not just meeting with the State Department, but whatever agency that impacts the work at the state and local level to follow up on recommendations, and making sure that we create concrete recommendations to the U.S. government on how they can implement the UN recommendations that come from the UN. So it's not just saying, well, the UN suggested that, for instance, on felony disenfranchisement, that the United States move very quickly to ensure that we are that we end the practice of felony disenfranchisement in the United States. Well, that's such a big recommendation, and that's so important. But how do we, on the advocacy and back home, are breaking that down into concrete proposals that are actually doable and achievable, recognizing the political construct of which we provide? So getting congressional action will probably be very difficult. But what are some federal directives? What are some mandates? What are some policy changes that may be executive orders that could be put in place that could actually help move us towards those recommendations? So that's one thing that we spend a lot of time focusing on. What and how can we make concrete recommendations to various agencies within their power to ensure that we're moving forward on these recommendations? The second part is making sure that we tell the story of what happened in Geneva through communication when we get home. So not just before we go to Geneva and while we're in Geneva, but when we come home, writing op-eds, telling the story. I was in Geneva. This is what happened, and this is what came out of this, and this is how we can implement it in our communities. And that takes us to the final aspect, is working to ensure that what happens in the work in Geneva is shared with the grassroots. If we keep it in Washington, then that's not enough. Because local and state governments, and I know our colleagues, I know that the NAACP's vice chair of our board, Mr. Leon Russell, spent a long time in his career actually doing this work at the state and local level, leading this work in his professional capacity in Florida, and also led a national association of human rights advocates. And so there are people who work on this every single day, but it's important for us to make sure that we're moving this work to the grassroots through our chapters, through our branches, and through our networks and affiliates across the country. Next slide. This next slide just looks at some of the accomplishments that we've been able to have in some of our advocacy. We've been able to really highlight and raise the issue of felony disenfranchisement before the UN Human Rights Committee, sort of using this approach. We've elevated issues into national media. We've gotten articles written about felony disenfranchisement from the voices of people impacted in places both international media, national media, radio, and on cable television news. And we've had robust meetings and partnerships with several UN staff and Office of the High Commissioner and Special Rapporteurs to advance our domestic agenda. Next slide. I just wanted to illustrate and just show some pictures of just some of the folks that have really been the leading voices on some of our work and their impacted citizens. People like Dennis Gaddy, Jessica Chapone. We go to the next slide. People like Desmond Meade and people like Kimba Smith, who really have been leaders and voices and now are experts in navigating the UN system. And so I think that really just speaks to how do we as advocates, even if we live and do this every single day, make sure that we are empowering people impacted, not only just to speak, but also to understand the process, to know the process, to engage in the process, and to become advocates in this process. And that's a very important part of the work that we do, and we would encourage that others think about that as well. Of course, we also have board members and national leaders that work with us and that also have been a part of some of these processes. So you can see photos on this next slide, Cleola Brown and Dr. David Goatley. And then finally, their staff members. There's myself, Hillary Shelton, and a number of other staff members that work on this. As I close, I just want to say thank you to the U.S. Human Rights Network. I want to reiterate that we have to have a robust strategy going into Geneva, while we're in Geneva, but most importantly, when we get home. And it doesn't take a lot of resources to do this. You can do this with small delegations. You can do this with large delegations. You can do this with no delegation because the network really is a voice for those who aren't physically in Geneva. But even if you're not in Geneva, you can still do a lot of this work, promote this, watch the live proceedings, send shadow reports, and be very effective in advancing domestic policy issues in an international arena utilizing UN human rights instruments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jateka, for that wonderful presentation on how the NAACP has been using the United Nations and for very concrete strategic information. I'm hoping that listeners will use both the information that Jateka Edie from the NAACP provided and that Andrea Carmen from the International Indian Treaty Council provided to help inform your own strategies in using the CERD process and leveraging it robustly. These are two longtime activist leaders in the human rights community and in using these mechanisms. So we're so honored to have both of them here to present on how their organizations have used the process. So next up we have Salima Hankins, who is the CERD coordinator, and will be walking us through nuts and bolts on what next, given all the information that we've received.
Hi, everyone. As Adrian just said, Salima Hankins from the U.S. Human Rights Network. So on the last webinar, we talked a little bit about how to effectively engage the CERD review process. And we talked about potentially joining, emailing me to join issue-based working groups. For example, we have working groups that work on issues like criminal justice, environmental justice, and this will help to inform the advocacy both in Geneva and at home. But the deadline that's coming up right now is for the shadow reports. So folks will be finishing up their shadow reports on June 30th is our internal deadline that we've set for folks to send their final shadow reports to us. And I have here on the screen the email address, which is CERD@ushrnetwork.org. We'll be drafting an executive summary, basically summarizing what each of the reports says, and then sending that off to the CERD committee. If you are not planning to submit your shadow report through the network, then we've provided the information here for you to send it directly to the CERD Secretariat, and that email address is CERD@ohchr.org. You can see it here on the PowerPoint presentation. They've asked that you also, if you email the reports, that you also mail them 20 copies, so we've included the postal mail address as well. And also the State Department has asked that we CC them on any reports that are sent out. So I have that if you choose to, we have that email address as well. In addition to that, just in helping to prepare your reports, we have other resources available, including a list of organizations that are already submitting shadow reports. So if you are an organization that is interested in maybe last minute contributing to a shadow report or joining a shadow report as a sign-on, we have a list of organizations that that are on our website, and that's the link where it says to find list of CERD shadow reports. So you can go there and you can see all the reports that are being submitted through the network, and you can email me, and my email address is coming up. You can email me, and then we can I can try to connect you with those folks if you don't already have connections with them. So that's basically it. If you have any questions, so we provided all of these resources, including resources for, you know, a fact sheet information on what is ICERD. And if you have any more questions, you can also feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Salima. So now I think what we'll do is open it up for questions to see if people have questions. Now, if you have questions, you can raise your hand, and the way you do that is that you click, if you're on the computer, you can put your cursor over an icon on the top that says My Mood and raise your hand, and then we'll call on you. And Salima, if you can call on people when they raise their hands.
Yes, I can do that. Okay, I see, I see Rita Moran from California as the first person whose hand is raised. I think we have it now so where you can unmute yourself. Let me see.
Rita, can you hear me? Okay, it's not clear if Rita can hear us, so why don't we go to some of the questions on the chat? So this is a question for any one of the presenters. And it's basically asking, how can just a normal everyday person be involved in the process? I don't know if Andrea, Marcia, Joteka, if one of you want to answer that question.
Hi, this is Marcia. I'll give it a shot, and others may have something to add. So the U.S. Human Rights Network is a great, the U.S. Human Rights Network website is a great resource to find out, as Salima mentioned, who is engaging in the process and what reports they're working on. And as Salima mentioned, she's a great resource for connecting folks with the others who are working on a similar issue or topic that you might be interested in. So I would just encourage you to look at the network's website and get a sense of who's doing what and reach out. And I know that Salima would be happy to connect you with who's engaging, and we welcome individuals to get involved in this process as well, because we're really working on building this network of human rights fighters in the U.S. and ensuring that we were lifting up a lot of voices on the issues that the CERD treaty deals with, and also that we are dealing with all the time domestically.
Thank you, Marcia.
I could make a comment as well.
Okay, great.
If that's okay. I just wanted to say that, to me, we're all ordinary people, and some of us have learned by trial and error about utilizing the international process. But the main thing, and I think the other presenters stressed this too, is this is just a tool, one of many in the struggles that we have on the ground. And some of us who've learned a little bit more about that can communicate, and we do trainings and involve a lot of grassroots peoples. But one thing that's really important, for the submissions that we make, for example, I could give the example on protecting sacred areas, is we get community testimonies.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
Sorry, I just got a message about unmuting. You can hear me, right?
Yes, I'm sorry, Andrea. That was my fault.
Okay, no, that's okay. No, I was just saying that, collecting community testimonies is very important, not just the data and the statistics, but the experiences of whether they're prisoners or whether they're elders that are charged with protecting sacred sites, or women who've been victims of sexual or other forms of violence. We have a lot of community testimonies that we've collected in northern Mexico from families that have lost children, people who have cancer, etc., about the impact of the export of banned pesticides by U.S. corporations. And so those kinds of grassroots statements and experiences really carry a lot of weight with the CERD. And so I think that's a way that we as activists can involve our own grassroots peoples in making these statements to say, what is the violation? What is the abuse? How are people being discriminated against in their own words and their own language?
Thank you, Andrea. So I don't know if Rita is still on the call. You had your hand raised initially, and I think now you can unmute yourself to ask a question by pressing *6. Okay, so I'm not sure if Rita is still is able to unmute herself, but in the meantime, people can also send in questions by using the chat function to send in a question. And there is a question all the way from Pakistan asking how groups can support Shadow Report from Pakistan. And I would just answer briefly to say that if Pakistan, for this particular mechanism that we're talking about, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, if Pakistan has ratified the treaty, then the government of Pakistan will come up for review, and so groups in Pakistan can participate in the shadow reporting process for that review. Otherwise, for the U.S. review coming up, any country can really submit, any group can really submit a shadow report, although it's my understanding that civil society groups that are within the country that's being reviewed can sometimes have more weight, but there's no preclusion from any country submitting a shadow report for the U.S. review itself, or any group from any country submitting a shadow report.
The next person who has their hand raised is Brenda Golden from Oklahoma. And you can press star 6 to unmute yourself.
Okay, so Brenda is saying that we already answered her question.
Oh, great. Okay, so the next person is Avalon Levy from New York City. Avalon, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question by pressing star 6.
So I see there's a question on the chat line from Avalon. So, and the question is, I am curious if part of the United States government's reluctance to pass CERD has anything to do with obligations it would have to Native peoples. Can you speak to barriers?
I can answer that briefly, if that's okay. I can, since
yes,
focusing on Indigenous peoples. First of all, the United States has ratified the ICERD. The ICERD is the convention, the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the CERD is the nickname for the committee, the monitoring body. So actually, why we're engaged in this process is it already is ratified by the United States, and so they are legally bound to comply. And the function of the committee is to review compliance. The United States has a very strange approach to it that we're actually addressing in one of our shadow reports, where they say they consider the convention legally binding, but not the recommendations by the committee. And I've heard myself personally, U.S. State Department representatives say that twice at different meetings that I was at. So because the committee, the monitoring body, was actually created in the text of the convention, it's part of the convention, and therefore our question is, well then how do you think that states can be monitored for their compliance if you don't think that the recommendations are legally binding, but you think the convention is? And are all states responsible for self-monitoring? Is that what you're saying? And of course they don't agree with that either. So they're in kind of a difficult position, and they have specifically taken exception on recommendations having to do with Indigenous peoples, and especially the strong stand of the CERD that I mentioned in General Recommendation 23, which is actually stronger than the text of the UN Declaration regarding return of lands and resources that were taken without consent. It doesn't give much wiggle room for them. So, yeah, they are kind of between a rock and a hard place on the rights of Indigenous peoples, especially since the CERD has elevated its perspective on the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples to bring it in the realm of a legally binding obligation, which the U.S. obviously thinks it's aspirational, or whatever the words that they use. So it is a challenge for them relating to the strong positions the CERD has taken on Indigenous peoples, and of course it's an advantage for us, even though, as many have said, the real key is always implementation back home on the ground, but it gives us a very strong tool that we may not have otherwise to promote compliance with the rights that we're working on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Andrea. Next, I'll read a question that was submitted through the chat, which is there a way we can contribute facts and knowledge to a shadow report without writing our own submission? I know it is late and the deadline is next week, but is it worth reaching out to subject matter leads? I would say, this is Adrian DK from the U.S. Human Rights Network again, and I would say yes, you can absolutely contact the subject matter leads, the working group leads, and if you need more information on how to do that, you can contact Salima Hankins, and her email address is shankins@ushrnetwork.org. But the deadline that we've put up, which is June 30th, and Salima just shared her email address on the chat. The deadline we put up, which is June 30th, is our strongly suggested deadline, and it's a deadline for the network to receive the shadow reports so that we can ensure that we will include them in the executive summary that we draft for submission. However, you do have a little more time if you want to submit the shadow report directly to the United Nations. Having said that, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we are, and most of us who've been engaged in this work, are really recommending that people try to submit joint reports. So if you don't feel you have the time, and you can reach out to groups and share important facts and information with them to include in their shadow reports, that is probably a good way to go about it at this point. Next up, we have Cindy Fisher, who has her hand raised. Cindy, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6. Okay, I'm not sure if people are able to unmute themselves. So it might, I'd suggest that if you have a question and you're trying to unmute yourself and cannot, if you would submit it via chat. That way we can read the question.
I think I just did it. Hello?
Oh, hi.
This is Cindy Fisher. Yes.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes. Okay, I'm from Vancouver, Washington, and I'm co-writing a shadow report. My group is called the Moms, and we're mothers and others who have had mostly adults, but even minor children that have been extremely abused and human rights violated within the mental health system, within the institutions, and with outpatients forced treatment. And we are co-writing our report with the Center for the Human Rights of Survivors and Users of Psychiatry. And I would like to say that I feel like the oppression and racism that happens under the mental health umbrella is something that's not well known, and it's a very covert way that is being used in the United States. And I've been kind of like an investigative journalist. I have recordings from people inside the institutions. I've had personal experience and work with mostly mothers across the country. And what I would like to know, if there are others out there that also have that focus or information. Our children are being taken out of homes, put in foster care and drugged, or young men are taken into the jail for minor offenses and declared incompetent to stand trial, and perhaps for the first time in their life sent up to the mental hospitals and drugged for 6 months to a year, and come out very severely harmed from very, very strong drugs that are meant for one specific purpose but are used supposedly to bring our young adults into competency. So I'd like to know if there are others out there, and I have a web page that describes some of the cases that I've worked on that are just really outrageous. And my website is called rights, and rights is RIGHTS, and then the word yes.org. So there's four words: mental health rights yes.org. And I'm not a webmaster. There's lots of errors in it. I've done this mostly on my own and with other mothers who are also desperate. But the stories, the videos, the all of that in there is all verified, documented information. So please contact me. Also, you can write me at Cindy, C-I-N-D-I, Pacha, P-A-C-H-A, at gmail.com. If you have any information, or if you have a loved one that's locked up and want to know some of the things that we have used to help our children escape. It's really the new Jim Crow part too, that most folks think mental health treatment is a good thing, and it should be a good thing, but it's being abused horribly.
Thank you, Cindy, for the comment and question. And if you have not already sent information about the shadow report that you're writing to Salima Hankins, please do, because there are others who are definitely writing on related issues, including the use of psychotropic drugs on children in foster care, the forced removal of children from their homes to foster care, and the forced psychiatric treatment that I'm sure you could connect with. So if you have not already shared that information with Salima, and this goes to everyone on the call, if you're writing a shadow report and have not shared that information with us yet, please do, because we can help you make connections with other groups working on similar topics. And you can also find a list of the shadow reports we're writing on our website, or people are writing on our website, so that you can also see who you might want to connect with as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have another question, and we have a couple more questions that are on the chat, and these may be the last two questions we can take. But the first question is, can you please comment on concluding observations and recommendations of the committee on the U.S. or United States progress in implementing CERD?
Mm-hmm.
So do any of the presenters want to comment on that? Okay, so if anyone else wants to jump in, please do, but I can respond to that to say that as you probably know, after every review, the committee of the independent body of experts. Oh, I'm sorry. If you have your phone, could you mute your phone if you have it unmuted, because there's some background noise?
How do you mute it?
I believe. Hang on, I may be able to do this. Okay, it's muted. Yes. So the committee issues concluding observations right after. One second. Sorry. You might need to mute it on your actual phone. I'm not sure.
How do I mute it? What do I do?
I'm not sure. It depends on your phone. So you'll just need to look for a mute function on your phone. But you can try *6 as well. I'm not sure if that will work. Okay, sorry about that. The committee issues concluding observations after each review, which are essentially recommendations for what the country needs to do to comply fully with CERD. And the committee issued recommendations to the United States government after the last review in 2008. And many of the groups that are, both the groups that spoke today and many of the groups that are part of the network that we've been working with have been pushing the administration to implement those concluding observations. Part of the review this time, and part of what we're encouraging people to do in their shadow reports, is to comment on how far the U.S. has gone in implementing those concluding observations. So there's an opportunity for individuals and groups like ours who are part of this CERD process to push the administration on the concluding observations. Something else that we will share after this webinar is that the U.S. government is planning to consult with civil society on CERD and its implementation of CERD on July 8th in Washington, D.C., and we shared that invitation with people who are subscribed to our listserv. So if you did not get the invitation and you want to participate in person or via phone, you will need to RSVP. We will resend that invitation to the listserv. So join the listserv so that you can get that invitation that was sent out. And that is another opportunity to be part of a conversation with the administration on how it can better implement the concluding observations and the treaty as a whole. We have one more question, and the question is from Michael, who's asking, is it possible to bring a lawsuit, I presume, against the United States for non-compliance?
So this is Marcia. I'll take that on. So unfortunately, when the U.S. ratified the CERD treaty, it did not make the treaty self-executing. So what that means is that you can't bring a claim in the U.S. courts under the treaty. So we have to rely on engagement with the administration and use persuasive advocacy to ensure compliance. Some of us do talk about the obligations in any court filings we do, just with the hopes that the court would reference it as an additional obligation that the U.S. has, but unfortunately at this time we can't just bring a claim under the treaty by itself in court.
This is Andrea, and I agree with we even use, quite frequently the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, even though, it's not considered legally binding by the United States anyway, because it's a declaration. But the more we use all of these mechanisms in all of our work, our declarations, our resolutions from our organization, tribal government resolutions, as well as court cases, which people do frequently, the stronger that recognition of its binding quality will be. And I just am recalling that a couple of years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court shocked everybody by citing in one of its decisions the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the United States is one of two countries globally which has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They've signed it, which means an intent to think about it, I guess, but they haven't actually ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But the Supreme Court cited it in a case it was dealing with about, I believe it was on execution of or death penalty for someone that was 17 when they committed a crime. And that shocked everybody because the U.S. has not even ratified it. So it is possible, to give these processes a lot more teeth by the fact that we're raising it, we're using it. I'm sure some attorneys that submitted that case cited it, and that's where the Supreme Court got the idea. And I just want to conclude by saying, we say this about the declaration of the CERD concluding observations. One of the leaders of the Navajo Nation was saying, I was always saying, we need these processes at the UN need to have teeth. When are they going to have teeth? How do we give it teeth? And then I finally realized we are the teeth. And with that, I'll leave you. We are the teeth. And our activism on the ground, utilizing these processes and all the other things that we do, to, struggle on our rights, we'll give these processes teeth, and the United States will begin to implement them if there is a broad call for them to do so.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and those were perfect words, thoughts to end the question and answer portion of the webinar today. We've put up on the screen some next steps that people can take, including how you find out how you join a working group by sending an email to Salima Hankins. We have a link for how you join the CERD listserv. We would love for everyone to become a member of the U.S. Human Rights Network. And of course, we're encouraging everyone to participate in the Twitter rally that we are planning for the National Day of Action on July 2nd, and we will be circulating information about that as well. And then, of course, like we said earlier, submit or contribute to a shadow report. And please let us know if you're already working on a shadow report. And so we also have links online. We've written out the links in case you're not able to click on them when we send this PowerPoint around for people to access the information directly. And so with that, I would say thank you so much to our presenters today, to Marcia Johnson-Blanco, to Andrea Carmen, to Jateka Edie, and to Salima Hankins. We really appreciate the time you took and all the invaluable information that you've shared with people today. We are really hoping that everyone will take full advantage of the information that's been provided and use it to leverage the CERD review to its fullest. We have a unique opportunity this year in that we have the U.S. being reviewed on 3 human rights treaties, the main ones that it has ratified, human rights treaties. But like Andrea reminded us, there are over 300 treaties that the U.S. government has signed with Indigenous peoples. But the reviews happening this year are for the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that happened in March. CERD, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, is happening this August 13th or 14th. The Convention Against Torture, that happens in November. And then next year, the Universal Periodic Review, which will cover all the human rights covered in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we really hope that people will take full advantage of this process, not only to promote a human rights agenda in the U.S., but to really strengthen and grow the human rights movement that we have here in this country. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.